The case was supposed to be finished. According to the initial report, the incident had been reviewed, categorized, and formally closed. There were no further actions required, no additional questions, no unresolved concerns, at least on paper. The file was archived, stamped, and placed where closed cases usually go, out of sight and eventually out of mind. But some cases do not stay where they are put. Long after the official conclusion was released, fragments of doubt continued to surface. Not dramatic revelations, not explosive accusations, just small, persistent irregularity. Details that did not align, gaps that were never addressed, silence where clarification should have existed. This is one of those cases. At the center of the file is a young individual whose final days remain only partially documented. Publicly, the narrative appears simple. Privately, however, the timeline tells a more complicated story, one that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore the longer it is examined. According to records, the last confirmed interactions followed a routine pattern. Messages were exchanged. Meetings occurred as scheduled. Nothing outwardly suggested an emergency. Yet several hours within that timeline remain unaccounted for. No explanations were offered. No follow-up statements were recorded. Those missing hours were treated as insignificant, despite their position at the most critical point of the sequence. Investigators often say that what matters most in a case is not what is present, but what is absent. In this file, absence is everywhere. Witness accounts were brief and carefully worded. Each statement taken individually appeared reasonable. Together, they formed a mosaic that never fully connected. Certain details were repeated verbatim across different accounts. Other details equally relevant were omitted entirely. Whether this was coincidence or caution was never clarified. Digital traces offered little resolution. Several posts referencing the individual appeared briefly, then disappeared. Screenshots circulated, but originals could not be verified. Some messages were deleted. Others were edited without explanation. No single action was alarming on its own, yet the pattern was unmistakable. Information surfaced, then retreated. Public attention followed a similar rhythm. Initial concern gave way to speculation. Speculation gave way to fatigue. Eventually, the conversation slowed, as conversations often do, but it never stopped entirely. Instead, it moved underground, into private discussions, archived forums, personal records kept by individuals who refuse to accept closure without answers. What makes this case unusual is not the presence of controversy, but the persistence of questions long after interest should have faded. There are no definitive claims here, no conclusions offered, only a growing recognition that the official explanation does not fully account for the evidence that remains. In investigative work, closure is not defined by a declaration. It is defined by resolution, and resolution requires clarity. In this case, clarity never arrived, and as we begin to examine the timeline more closely, one overlooked detail emerges, small enough to dismiss at first glance, yet impossible to ignore once seen. It is a detail that should have been documented. It was not. What was missing from the timeline was not an accident, and it was never explained. Reconstructing the final days requires discipline, not intuition, not emotion, only sequence, documentation, and restraint. When investigators rebuild a timeline, every hour matters. Every interaction carries weight, and every gap demands explanation, even when none is offered. According to available records, the last week followed a pattern that appeared routine on the surface. Communications continued as expected. Appointments were neither canceled nor postponed. Messages sent during that period contained no explicit references to distress or imminent danger. To an outside observer, nothing seemed out of place. Yet timelines rarely fail because of what they show. They fail because of what they omit. On the final day, the sequence becomes less precise. Several actions are documented only approximately. Times are rounded. Locations are implied rather than confirmed. The language used in subsequent summaries shifts subtly, relying on phrases such as "around that time" and "later that evening." In investigative work, such phrasing often signals uncertainty rather than clarity. One interaction stands out not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. A brief exchange occurred earlier that day. The content itself was unremarkable. No threats, no conflict, no indication of urgency. However, the timing of the exchange presents a complication. It occurred shortly before a period that remains entirely unaccounted for. From that moment forward, the record goes quiet. No confirmed movements, no verified communications, no witnesses who could place the individual with certainty. Several hours disappear from the sequence without explanation. When questioned indirectly in later statements, those familiar with the situation described this absence as insignificant, a gap that required no special attention. Yet in most case reviews, unaccounted time immediately preceding an incident is never treated as trivial. It is often the most scrutinized segment of the entire timeline. Here, it was largely ignored. Subsequent documentation resumes only after the incident had already occurred. By then, the narrative had shifted. The focus was no longer on prevention or warning signs, but on classification. The language became procedural. Terms such as incident, outcome, and conclusion replaced any attempt to explore what may have happened during those missing hours. The lack of specificity raises another concern. Multiple summaries reference similar sequences of events, yet the phrasing is strikingly consistent across different sources. Certain sentences appear nearly identical. Key descriptors are repeated word for word. This uniformity suggests coordination rather than independent recollection, though no evidence exists to confirm intent. In isolation, such repetition could be dismissed as coincidence. In context, it becomes harder to ignore. There is also the matter of timing discrepancies. In one account, the final confirmed contact is placed earlier than in another. The difference is small, less than an hour, but in a compressed timeline, even minutes can alter interpretation. No attempt was made to reconcile these inconsistencies. They remain unresolved within the file. Digital records offer limited assistance. Metadata is incomplete. Some entries appear to have been modified after initial posting. Others are referenced but no longer accessible. Whether this resulted from routine maintenance, privacy settings, or deliberate removal is unknown. The record provides no clarification. What remains clear is that the timeline as presented relies heavily on assumption that no additional interactions occurred, assumption that missing data carries no significance, assumption that the documented sequence is sufficient. In investigative methodology, assumptions are placeholders, not conclusions. They are meant to be challenged, tested, and either confirmed or discarded. In this case, they were accepted without scrutiny. As attention to the timeline faded, so did the likelihood of revisiting its gaps. The file moved forward without revision. The unanswered hours were left behind, unresolved and unexplored. Yet those hours sit precisely where clarity is most needed. And buried within that missing window is a single reference, subtle enough to escape notice, but specific enough to raise concern once identified. It appears only once. It was never explained. A minor discrepancy in the recorded time would later become the most difficult detail to dismiss. In most investigations, silence arrives gradually. It does not announce itself. It settles in quietly, filling the spaces where answers were expected to appear. In this case, silence did not follow resolution. It preceded it. When inquiries began, responses were minimal. Statements were short, carefully framed, and narrowly focused. Those who were asked to clarify details did not refuse outright. Instead, they offered generalities. Memory was described as uncertain. Timelines were blurred. Responsibility was deferred. No single statement raised immediate concern. The pattern did. Several individuals who had interacted with the subject in the days leading up to the incident acknowledged contact, but only in the broadest terms. Descriptions avoided specifics. Locations were referenced without precision. Emotional states were summarized rather than explained. The absence of detail was consistent across multiple accounts. Consistency can suggest reliability. It can also suggest caution. No formal contradictions were recorded. No witness openly challenged another. Yet when accounts are placed side by side, they do not reinforce each other. They overlap without aligning. Key moments are mentioned without context. Certain events are referenced without timestamps. Others are skipped entirely. The result is not a coherent narrative, but a series of partial recollections that never converge. Digital evidence might have provided clarity. Instead, it introduced new uncertainty. Posts related to the individual, appeared briefly across multiple platforms, then vanished. Some were deleted within hours. Others remained visible only to limited audiences. Screenshots circulated privately, preserved by those who anticipated their disappearance. The original sources, however, were often inaccessible by the time questions were raised. Edits were made without notation. Captions were altered. Dates were adjusted. In several instances, content that had been acknowledged publicly could no longer be located at all. There was no official explanation for these changes. They were attributed informally to routine account management. Yet the timing of these deletions coincided closely with the emergence of public interest. This does not prove intent, but it complicates interpretation. In cases involving digital traces, absence is not neutral. Deletion removes context. It erases not only content, but sequence. Without sequence, causality becomes speculative. And speculation, once dismissed, often returns when patterns persist. Observers noted that those who spoke the least attracted the least scrutiny. Silence drew no headlines. It generated no confrontation. Over time, it became the safest position available. Public attention shifted accordingly. Initial concern gave way to fragmented discussion. Online forums archived threads. Private groups continued to exchange information quietly. Individuals who attempted to consolidate findings did so without coordination, relying on saved material and personal notes rather than official sources. This decentralized effort lacked authority, but it possessed endurance. What emerges from these collective observations is not a revelation, but a tension. The case was officially closed, yet behavior surrounding it suggested continued caution. Information was not challenged directly, but it was also not reinforced. The narrative remained thin, supported more by repetition than by verification. One detail in particular continued to resurface. It involved a brief interaction acknowledged by more than one party, yet described differently each time. The discrepancy was subtle. The substance of the interaction remained consistent, but its timing did not. In one account, it occurred earlier. In another, later. The difference was small enough to overlook until it was compared. No effort was made to reconcile these versions. The inconsistency was not addressed in follow-up summaries. It was neither corrected nor explained. It remained embedded in the record, unresolved. Silence in this context does not indicate guilt, but it does indicate avoidance. And avoidance, when sustained across witnesses and platforms, becomes part of the evidence, even when no one acknowledges it as such. As the digital trail grew thinner and witness accounts remained vague, attention turned toward what could still be measured. Patterns, and, within those patterns, one action by the broader community would ensure that the case could not simply fade away. An action taken quietly by the public would prevent the file from ever being fully erased. When a single case refuses to resolve, investigators widen the frame, not to dilute responsibility, but to test whether the irregularities observed are unique or familiar. Patterns do not establish guilt. They establish context, and context determines whether unanswered questions are anomalies or symptoms. This case is not isolated in its structure. Across numerous unresolved files, similar elements recur with unsettling consistency. A rapid classification, a reliance on summary rather than sequence, statements that are technically sufficient, yet narratively incomplete. Each component taken alone appears procedural. Taken together, they form a recognizable shape. The first indicator is speed. In cases where cause and circumstance are genuinely clear, efficiency is expected. Documentation proceeds quickly because little remains to interpret. Here, however, speed preceded clarity. Conclusions were reached before key intervals were examined. The timeline gaps identified earlier were never addressed, yet the file advanced regardless. The absence of follow-up was treated as resolution. The second indicator is language. Official summaries tend to favor neutral phrasing. That neutrality, however, can become a shield. Terms such as "no further action required" and "insufficient evidence to pursue additional inquiry" appear frequently across unrelated cases that later attract scrutiny. These phrases do not state certainty. They signal termination. Termination of inquiry is not the same as explanation. The third indicator is diffusion of responsibility. No single party is assigned authority over unresolved elements. Questions are redirected. Clarification is deferred. Each component of the process is said to fall outside the scope of another. In such systems, no decision is overtly wrong, yet no answer is fully owned. This diffusion is evident here. Key discrepancies were acknowledged informally, then set aside. Digital irregularities were noted but not investigated. Witness ambiguity was accepted as limitation rather than challenge. Each step followed protocol. The outcome, however, was a file that answered fewer questions than it raised. Comparative review reveals that such outcomes often depend less on intent than on momentum. Once a narrative gains institutional weight, altering it requires effort that few are incentivized to provide. Revisiting conclusions invites complication. Complication invites scrutiny. Scrutiny prolongs exposure. Closure, therefore, becomes preferable to clarity. This preference does not imply malice. It implies prioritization. Public response disrupts that prioritization. In this case, attention did not concentrate through official channels. It accumulated gradually, distributed across individuals who documented inconsistencies independently. No single repository existed. No coordinated effort was announced. Instead, fragments were preserved quietly. Screenshots, archived posts, notes on timing, comparisons of phrasing. None of this constituted proof. It constituted memory. Memory complicates closure because it resists erasure. When records vanish, memory fills the gap. When explanations thin, recollection thickens. The persistence of public memory does not resolve cases, but it prevents them from disappearing entirely. This is why some files never truly close. They remain accessible, not through institutions, but through individuals who continue to ask the same restrained questions. Why was this interval ignored? Why was this discrepancy not reconciled? Why was this detail excluded from the summary? The most persistent question, however, is the simplest. If this was merely an unfortunate but straightforward incident, why does its documentation require so much silence? Silence does not answer questions. It postpones them. And postponed questions tend to return, often when least expected. As attention cycles inevitably shift, files like this linger at the edges of collective awareness, not as accusations, not as conclusions, but as unresolved narratives waiting for either explanation or acknowledgement. In investigative work, unresolved does not mean unimportant. It means unfinished. And unfinished files have a way of resurfacing. If this case truly required no further inquiry, the question remains, why were so many questions never allowed to be asked? Every investigation ends the same way on paper. A conclusion is written. A classification is assigned. The file is marked complete. From an administrative standpoint, this is closure. From an investigative standpoint, it is not always resolution. In this case, the official record provides an ending without explanation. It accounts for outcomes, but not for sequence. It documents conclusions, but not the process by which those conclusions were reached. Most notably, it leaves critical questions when answered, not because answers were disproven, but because they were never fully examined. What we know is limited but precise. We know there were unaccounted hours. We know timelines contained inconsistencies that were never reconciled. We know digital traces appeared and disappeared without clarification. We know witness accounts remained vague, consistent in tone, but imprecise in substance. None of these elements prove wrongdoing. Together, however, they undermine certainty. In investigative analysis, certainty is not achieved through repetition. It is achieved through verification. When verification is absent, confidence becomes performative. It appears complete, but it rests on assumptions rather than evidence. The most telling aspect of this case is not what was discovered, but what was deemed unnecessary to pursue. Questions were postponed. Clarifications were deferred. Gaps were treated as inconsequential. Each decision viewed individually seemed reasonable. Viewed collectively, they resulted in a narrative that explains less than it claims. There is no accusation here, no verdict offered, no demand for judgment, only acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the record is incomplete. Acknowledgement that silence replaced inquiry. Acknowledgement that closure was administrative, not investigative. For those who continue to revisit this file, the motivation is not outrage. It is recognition. Recognition that unresolved cases do not disappear simply because attention moves elsewhere. They persist in archives, in personal records, and in the memories of those who noticed what others overlooked. Public memory does not deliver justice, but it preserves questions. And questions, when preserved, retain the power to resurface. Perhaps no new evidence will emerge. Perhaps explanations will remain out of reach. That outcome is possible. But until every interval is accounted for, until every discrepancy is addressed, the case cannot honestly be described as complete. It can be closed, but it cannot be finished. In investigative work, there is a difference, and that difference defines this file. Until the last unanswered question is addressed, this file remains open,